seen the flags. We've seen the outward bigotry.
Tonight, the truckers' occupation of downtown Ottawa has this group closing its doors.
We think the bad old days of governments unilaterally acting and just doing whatever they want without explaining themselves is, should be in the historic wastebasket.
A loss in court doesn't mean the fight is over for the Métis in Alberta.
It makes it even harder because the law implies that there is not great things going on when an Indigenous person enters the land.
And unlikely partners struggle to uphold a treaty right. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Victory this week for First Nations in Quebec. According to a recent ruling by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, discrimination played a part in the underfunding of a regional police force in a northern Innu community. Mastoyache is about 300 kilometers north of Quebec City. Leaders there filed a complaint with the tribunal in December 2020, saying that underfunding of the community's police force was complicating service delivery. In their late January ruling, the tribunal agreed the federal government discriminated against the police force. Canada now has 30 days to appeal the decision, and a second hearing will be held to determine corrective measures.
Nous espérons que ces réparations se traduisent notamment par un changement dans la méthode de financement afin d'assurer la pérennité de notre sécurité publique et pour pouvoir offrir des services policiers égaux aux autres instances policières.
The communities cannot compete with the packages that other police services offer. So that's discrimination right there. So I think there are many other examples that communities could provide.
Organizations that help vulnerable people are speaking out against the ongoing occupation of Ottawa's downtown core. A group of anti-COVID protesters say that it's impacting services that they deliver to clients, that those protesters are blocking the way of that. APTN's Fraser Needham explains.
This week, Tungas and Vigat Inuit issued a press release saying it is time for the Ottawa's anti-vaccine protest to stop because it is affecting the health, emergency housing, and food services they provide. Ottawa's Youth Services Bureau also sent out a similar statement. Darren Graham says they have never had to close the doors of their drop-in centre, but that changed last weekend.
We've never had to close the doors for this kind of extended period of time. And really the reason and the rationale behind it was because we could not guarantee the safety of the clients that come to access their services. We didn't want to draw them into a space that seems very unsafe.
The Freedom Convoy's leaders have repeatedly stated it is open, tolerant, and welcoming to everyone. But Graham says this is simply not the case.
And we've heard multiple times that they do not feel safe. We've seen the flags, we've seen the outward bigotry, we've heard staff and clients alike being harassed for just moving through their community.
With more protesters expected to come into the nation's capital this weekend, Graham says his organization will once again have to close the drop-in centre. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
In Alberta, a leader of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation says the ongoing blockade at the Alberta-U.S. border shows a double standard when it comes to Indigenous protests. As the blockade in Coutts, Alberta continues, Chief Alan Adam believes protesters would have been arrested had they been Indigenous. In 2020, the provincial government passed a Critical Infrastructure Defence Act preventing protests from blocking critical infrastructure. The legislation was brought into effect after Indigenous protesters blocked railways in support of Wet'suwet'en, but it doesn't seem to be used in this instance, and Chief Adam says he wants to see the bill dismantled.
It's disrupting the supply chain into Alberta and into Montana from Alberta as well. So is it a double standard that this bill comes into effect, or does it apply to everyone, or is it just Bill 1, meaning Bill 1 to the First Nations people? We're starting to see that the supply chain has taken longer to get to our communities because the products are not there.
Last June, the Métis Nation of Alberta sued the Alberta government for opting out of a consultation policy. In January, the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench dismissed their case. This week, the MNA announced that they are appealing that decision. APTN's Chris Stewart explains.
The Métis Nation of Alberta say they have been in negotiations with the two previous Alberta governments over a consultation policy. And a tentative agreement was made with the then NDP government. Shortly after coming into power in 2019, the MNA Indigenous Relations Minister Rick Wilson issued them a letter cancelling the agreement with no reason why given. In June of 2021, the Métis Nation of Alberta sued the Alberta government to get back to the table and draft a consultation policy.
Alberta deliberates endlessly on whether to consult with Métis communities using a case-by-case approach that is tangled in red tape and that Alberta's own bureaucrats have admitted does not work. This is systemic racism in action.
The MNA challenged the minister's decision on the basis of, if there's a duty to negotiate, at the very least, you have to inform the Indigenous group that you're negotiating with why you're ending the negotiations. The MNA literally had to sue in order to get access to the secret internal documents that set out the rationale for why Alberta decided to do a 180 turn.
In January, the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench concluded that the province had met its obligations, and they did not need to pursue a consultation policy.
Unfortunately, the lower court said they disagreed with Alberta in relation to whether there was a duty to negotiate. They said, yes, Alberta and the MNA were negotiating, but the judge went on to find that what was done met the obligation.
The MNA are appealing to the Alberta Court of Appeal. They say the government must explain why the policy was cancelled and come back to the table.
In the age of reconciliation, we think the battle days of governments unilaterally acting and just doing whatever they want without explaining themselves is, should be in the historic wastebasket. And this case is about the duty to negotiate and what it requires in order to uphold the honor of the Crown.
The press secretary to the Indigenous Relations Minister, Adrian South, issued a statement which reads in part, Alberta's government values its relationship with the Métis as shown by our support of affordable housing projects, cultural outreach for Métis Crossing, ongoing supports during the pandemic, and continuous engagement with Alberta's Métis peoples since forming government in 2019. As this is currently before the courts, we cannot comment further on this matter. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
It's time for us to take a break, but coming up, some Northern Ontario First Nations are hoping a new documentary will help their youth.
We have the rolling hills, we have, our own sacred teaching sites where we intend to have bigger events for our kids.
The Saskatchewan government's new trespass to property law requires anyone wanting to access private property to hunt or fish to get the owner's consent. But some Indigenous hunters and farmers say that the law is unfair and it actually could be dangerous. APTN's Leanne Sanders explains.
Autumn Baptiste is a member of a grassroots group of hunters, farmers, and other landowners called the Treaty Land Sharing Network. They're critical of the amendment to the trespassing law, which came into effect January 1st. It states people accessing land without permission from the owner could face a fine of up to $5,000. Baptiste says the legislation criminalizes Indigenous people for exercising their right to hunt, and adds a level of fear because her cousin was Colton Bushy, who was shot and killed by a farmer when he and a group of friends went onto his property. The farmer was charged with murder and manslaughter, but was acquitted in 2018.
For me, the history is my late cousin Colton Bushy. We all know what happened, and for that, it instilled a fear with me. And so having this legislation in place creates even greater fear for me because it makes me wonder about not only my life, but all the Indigenous people who are using their rights to live off the land, their inherent rights as Indigenous people to continue on that culture and that identity.
A statement emailed to APTN from the Saskatchewan Justice Department states, in part, The recent related amendments were never intended to affect treaty hunting and fishing rights, and indeed, by law, cannot affect those rights. But Joel Mochenko, a farmer who's part of the Treaty Land Sharing Network, says it does.
What they're suggesting is that anyone who wants to access land, and as far as I can see in the legislation, that means anyone, and that would be Indigenous land users as well, needs to ask permission to do that. And to me, if you have to ask permission to exercise a right, it's no longer a right.
Mochenko says some farmers and ranchers have concerns about safety of their families and livestock, but he says this law does nothing to address those concerns. For Autumn Baptiste, the government should have done more to consult with Indigenous people.
It makes it even harder because the law implies that there is not great things going on when an Indigenous person enters the land. And so it creates more of a tension between relationships.
The network says its role is not to lobby the government, but it will continue its work, building partnerships between Indigenous people and landowners. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A new documentary by the Kenora Chiefs Advisory highlights some of the programs that they have for youth, while also giving them a chance to deal with the intergenerational trauma of the past. Our Daryl Stranger has those details.
The Journey Home is a documentary that touches on past harm First Nations people and communities have faced, while exploring programs and services offered today to help ensure the survival of the Anishinaabe way. The Kenora Chiefs Advisory hopes the film will also help youth to heal from the intergenerational trauma.
And we work with them through the trauma they've experienced in their life. We help guide them to, setting themselves goals of where they want to go, for people to know, and giving them, like I say, opportunities just to have fun. There's so much sorrow in our First Nation communities. We all know that. And, a lot crisis after crisis after crisis happens in our community, youth need to have some fun.
The short film highlights a youth and family wellness camp that is accessible by all the communities that purchased it in 2021.
We have the rolling hills, we have our own sacred teaching sites where we intend to have bigger events for our kids. We have areas identified for our elders, areas identified for specific teachings with our, whether it be, the traditional ceremonies, everything from top to bottom. And that space is true healing.
Started in 1995, the Kenora Chiefs Advisory is an alliance of 9 independent First Nations within the western region of Ontario. An Elders Council, Youth Council, and the communities collaborate on initiatives. Their mandate is to provide programs and services to First Nations in the field of health, education, and social services.
We need people to know that we are here. We are not going anywhere. We know what we're doing, and we know how to participate, focus, and take care of our most valuable resource, which is our children. Build them up, make them strong. We know what works, what hasn't worked, and sit back and listen. Sit back and take notes. Sit back and learn from what we know is best.
A horse-based therapy program, land-based healing, and a variety of sports are just a few examples of the programs offered. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
We really need to look at ourselves.
In Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq are out on the ice fishing, trying to catch a favorite dish. APTN's Angel Moore has a preview of what they're up to.
I'm here on the north shore of Nova Scotia, ice fishing for eel with 2 fishers from Pictou Landing First Nation as they fish for food to feed their families.
O'Neill.
Supper.
I'll tell you more about this story in the very near future.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Today's pick comes to us from Barb Hart in Enterprise Northwest Territories. That's just north of the border with Alberta. The coming hopes of the spring bring out the lights of the night. Never stops amazing me, says Barb. You can send us your amazing photos to share at aptn.ca for a chance to be our next photo of the day. Here's tomorrow's weather now. To the east coast, we've got 9 and showers for St. John's, -8, and snow expected for Halifax. Nookshwack, -29, and flurries for you in La Grande River, -25. Saguenay, sunshine, -17. Montreal, rain, -12. 13 for North Bay and sunny skies there. Snow for Sault Ste. Marie, -9. Snow for Sioux Lookout, -16. -23 in Big Trout Lake, and snow there too. Sunshine for Puckatawagan and -25. -25 but cloudy in Thompson. Snow and -15 for Winnipeg and Brandon. 0 and snow for Swift Current. 1 and snow for Saskatoon. -21 in snow for Buffalo Narrows. Sunshine and -27 in Stony Rapids. Fort Chip, -20 and snow there. 2 and sunshine for Grand Prairie. Snow and 3 degrees for Edmonton and Red Deer. 6 and sunny for Campbell River and Penticton. -12 in snow for Fort Nelson. 5 and sunshine for Prince George. -21 in snow for Dawson City. -35 in snow for Old Crow. Mixed sun and cloud, and -24 for Yellowknife. -11 and cloud for Fort Liard and Trout Lake. -34 for Fort McPherson and Inuvik, but sunny skies. -35 and sunny for Baker Lake and Chesterfield. Igloolik, -28 and snow. -33 and snow for Pangerton. When it comes to boutiques, Les Artisans Indiens de Quebec is among the last of its kind. The not-for-profit arts and crafts store is owned and operated by the Huron-Wendat people in Wendake. For more on that, here's Shushan Bacon in a story translated by Lindsay Richardson.
Bonjour Michel.
Hey,
oui.
Oh, je suis contente.
Re-bienvenue chez nous.
Les Artisans Indiens du Québec is the kind of place that has a following. If you're a First Nations artisan, you'll find much of what you need here. Leather, fur, feathers, and of course, beads. Lots and lots of beads.
Elle a été fondée en 1974. C'est issu d'un programme du ministère des Affaires indiennes à l'époque qui visait à soutenir tout le domaine socio-économique de l'artisanat autochtone au Canada. Alors, c'est un programme qui a été sur place pendant une vingtaine d'années. Et des corporations comme nous, il y en a ouvert à l'époque une vingtaine au Canada quand même. Et début des années 90, le gouvernement met fin à ce programme-là. Fait que les corporations comme ça ont tous fermé, sauf la nôtre.
Ah bon, I have to shop là. Yves Picard is Huron-Wendat and is the Director General of the store. He credits his mainly Indigenous clientele across Canada for keeping the business going. According to Picard, about 70% of his clients are from outside Quebec, so all his employees have to be fluent in French and English.
The Native Craft Supply, how can I help you?
Among their repeat customers is none other than Michelle Odette, the Innu Canadian senator. Odette doesn't like to order over the phone or online. She needs to see and feel the material she buys. She became acutely aware of this when the store was closed for 6 months during the pandemic.
Do you still have le wood, là? La perle représente pour moi une histoire, un esprit, un être humain ou quelque chose, un moment dans ma vie. Et j'habite ici, j'habite dans cette région-là. Et avant la COVID, je venais folle ici. Je perdais tous mes sens parce que j'apprenais à perler et je voyais là, ce qu'il y avait.
Au dos du médaillon, on a des petites retailles qu'on conserve, fait que ça peut être... Au lieu de manger tout mon beau cul... Exactement, on a plein de petites retailles.
Odette also appreciates the personalized advice that comes from employees who are First Nations, as well as their patience.
Parce que j'ai besoin, soit parce qu'on nous a appris à observer, et à toucher, à sentir ou ressentir, bien, c'est en venant ici, là, on me laissait faire. On me laissait là, taponner les sacs, quasiment les sentir, jouer avec les fils, brasser des affaires, ouvrir des tiroirs. Je vais t'en racheter parce que c'est avec ça que j'ai fait.
But not everyone has the same needs as Odette.
Prevail pelt, yes, of course. Do you want 1.5 inches or 2 inch?
In a world where many do their shopping online, the store needs to compete.
Là, c'est beau, ça.
So Picard used the time off early on in the pandemic to get a website up and running. And so far, the little artisanal shop that could keeps on going. In 2 years, it will be their 50th anniversary.
Je profite de l'occasion pour remercier encore toutes les communautés du Québec et du Canada. Et on vous invite à venir nous voir, venir voir nos produits. On est toujours là pour desservir notre clientèle privilégiée, qui sont les Premières Nations du Québec et du Canada.
A story by Shushan Bacon, APTN National News, Wendake, Quebec.
Tonight on APTN Investigates, Brittany Guillot brings us part 2 of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Men. Last week, she met the families of 3 victims near the Highway of Tears. This week, she takes her investigation to Manitoba, and she joins us now to discuss both stories. Brittany, thanks for joining us. So tell us a little bit about, for people who didn't maybe see part 1 or did see part 1 and need a little bit of a recap, what happened last week, and then get into what we're going to see tonight.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for having me on. So in part 1, we looked at the Highway of Tears out in Prince George, BC. So this whole part 1 and part 2 began, the investigation sort of began in the summer of last year after looking at the stats in the United States, where 70% of all missing Indigenous persons are actually males. And so this really stood out to me as something worth digging into. And so what I did was I compiled all the information I could find on missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys through different, open source data. And so over the course of that investigation, I found that there was 19 missing and murdered Indigenous men all along the Highway of Tears in BC.
And that's certainly something, I think we do oftentimes kind of forget about that. So kudos to you for bringing that back to the public foreground here. What about part 2 tonight? What are we going to see tonight? Give us a little, not too much because we want to watch, but give us a little teaser.
Yeah, so part 2, it sort of goes back to the data as well. The majority of missing and murdered Indigenous men that I found was, in the Prairie provinces. So that's where we focused part 2 on, was here in Manitoba. So I was able to identify 63 homicide cases that have gone cold and 18 domestic homicide abuses. So yeah, we talked to families here in Manitoba.
Well, that is coming up right after the news tonight. Can't wait to see that. Brittany, thanks for taking the time to give us a little heads up what's in store.
Thank you.
That is a wrap on your news for this Friday. But as we said, don't go anywhere. That APTN Investigates on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Men and Boys is on right now. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great night. I'm going to see you back here tomorrow.